There's something about working tirelessly for years, giving everything you have to a company, and believing that loyalty will mean something. That was the trap I fell into. I was the first one to arrive each morning, long before the office lights flickered on. I was the last one to leave, long after the cleaners made their rounds. For nearly a decade, I had built not just my career, but the very foundation of my company's success. I wasn't just an employee. I was the backbone, the problem solver, the person clients trusted more than the glossy brochures and flashy promises. When clients had issues, they didn't call the company's customer service. They called me directly. I had built relationships, real ones. People trusted me, not the brand name printed on the front door. And yet, none of that mattered the day I was called into my boss's office. The office itself was designed to intimidate. A wide mahogany desk that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, spotless leather chairs that seemed more like traps than seats, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like a kingdom. My boss sat there, smug as always, the kind of man who liked to believe success was entirely his doing, even when everyone else had carried him there. He didn't waste time with small talk. He never did. Instead, he leaned back, folded his hands, and delivered the blow like it was nothing more than a routine decision. We've decided to let you go. You've been a good worker, but at the end of the day, you're replaceable. Replaceable. That word hit harder than the firing itself. It was meant to cut deep, and it did. I wasn't just being laid off. I was being told that everything I had built, every long night, every missed holiday, every client saved from walking away, it all meant nothing. I sat there silently, my mind spinning. I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind him of the million-dollar contracts I had saved, the clients who had stayed loyal because of me, not him. But instead, I said nothing. Because at that moment, I realized something more powerful than words. If I was so replaceable, then he wouldn't even notice what would happen when I left. The days following my firing were a blur. I packed at my desk quietly, watched as coworkers avoided eye contact, and carried out my box of belongings like a criminal walking through a gauntlet of silent judges. My nameplate was gone in seconds, my email access revoked, my office key taken back, without so much as a thank you. 10 years of service erased in less than 10 minutes. But outside that building, beyond those sterile glass walls, was the truth my boss had chosen to ignore. Clients didn't call the company, they called me. They didn't renew contracts because of the brand, they renewed because of the trust we had built together. And if my boss thought he could simply replace that, he was in for a brutal awakening. I spent the first week in quiet reflection, not out of sadness but strategy. My boss had fired me, believing the company would go on as if nothing had changed. But he had underestimated just how much weight I carried. If he wanted to call me replaceable, then I would show him just how wrong he was. That I pulled out my old notebooks, filled with years of client interactions, notes, and personal details that had nothing to do with company files. Birthdays I remembered, anniversaries I never forgot, late-night phone calls when emergencies hit. All of it stored in my memory and written down in those dog-eared pages. I didn't need company files. I had something far stronger, trust. The next step wasn't revenge, not yet. It was patience. I needed to watch, to wait, to see how the company would stumble without me. And stumble it did. Within days, whispers reached me through old colleagues. Clients were calling, confused about why I wasn't answering their messages. Deadlines were being missed. Contracts were slipping. My replacement had no idea how to handle the delicate balancing act I had perfected. I could have sat back and watched it all burn. But revenge is best when it's personal. I didn't want to simply see the company fail. I wanted my boss to feel the collapse in his own hands, to realize exactly who he had called replaceable. That's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to steal anything. I wasn't going to hack into files or break laws. No, my plan was simpler and far more devastating. I was going to take the one thing the company couldn't survive without, the clients themselves. Because at the end of the day, they weren't his clients. They weren't the company's clients. They were mine. And one by one, I would prove it. The fire had been lit. The game had begun. And soon, My boss would learn that the most dangerous kind of revenge is the kind you never see coming until it's too late. As I closed my notebook that night, pen poised for the first step of my plan, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. My boss had fired me to show me my place, but I was about to show him his. The first move would come soon, and once it began, there would be no turning back. The first step in any revenge is precision. It's not about lashing out wildly. It's about hitting the right place at the right time with the right force. And for me, that meant choosing my first client carefully. Not all clients were equal. Some were small contracts, easily replaceable with new business. Others, however, were the lifeblood of the company, long-term, high-value, steady revenue streams that kept the lights on and the bills paid. My boss liked to think those clients were loyal to the brand, but I knew better. Their loyalty was to me. There was one client in particular who stood out, a large manufacturing firm whose contract brought in more money annually than half the company's smaller accounts combined. I had personally saved that account 3 years earlier when they had nearly walked away after a string of broken promises from management. I had worked late nights, weekends, and even traveled across states to repair the damage my boss had caused. By the end of it, the client didn't just trust me. They relied on me. If I could bring them over, the dominoes would fall. But it wasn't as simple as calling them up and saying, "Come with me." Revenge isn't about shortcuts. It's about leverage. So I began by planting seeds. I reached out casually, not as a competitor, but as an old friend checking in. I didn't mention my firing immediately. I asked about their latest projects, their struggles, their goals. And then, with careful timing, I let the truth slip in. I was no longer with the company. The reaction was immediate. Shock. Concern. Frustration. They hadn't even been informed. No courtesy call. No explanation. Just silence from a company that suddenly looked very different without me. That was the opening I needed. I didn't pitch anything right away. Instead, I let them stew in the reality. A company that would fire the one person who had held their contract together didn't look very reliable anymore. And when reliability is the backbone of business, doubt spreads quickly. Meanwhile, back at the company, cracks were already forming. My old coworkers whispered through back channels, feeding me information I didn't even have to ask for. The new hire, the so-called replacement, was floundering. Deadlines were missed. Emails went unanswered. The client I had spoken to, they were already complaining loudly to management about the sudden drop in service quality. That was when I made my move. I had spent years building my reputation, and I wasn't about to squander it on reckless anger. Instead, I created something new, a consultancy, small and agile, designed not to compete directly with the company, but to solve the very problems the company was failing at. My pitch was simple. I wasn't asking clients to abandon the brand immediately. I was offering them security. If they wanted continuity, if they wanted someone who understood them, I was available. When I finally laid this out to the manufacturing firm, they didn't hesitate. They didn't see me as a competitor. They saw me as a lifeline. Within weeks, they signed directly with me, pulling one of the largest accounts right out from under my boss's nose. And that was only the beginning. The satisfaction I felt wasn't just about money. It was about watching the look on my boss's face. Though I couldn't see it, I could picture it clearly when he realized his replaceable employee had just gutted a cornerstone of his company. The loss wasn't just financial. It was reputational. Other clients would see the cracks. And when one leaves, more always follow. But revenge is never complete with a single strike. One win doesn't topple an empire. It takes persistence, patience, and a relentless reminder that the person you underestimated is now the one dismantling everything you built. So I began working my way through the list. Each client was different, and each required a different approach. Some needed reassurance. Others needed proof of my independence. Some just needed to know they weren't alone in their frustrations with the company. The beauty of it was that I didn't have to sell myself aggressively. The company's failures did the work for me. All I had to do was step in at the right moment, with the right solution, and the clients followed naturally. Meanwhile, Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors turned into undeniable truths inside the company. My old coworkers were watching the collapse in real time. Meetings grew tense. Fingers pointed. And at the center of it all was my boss, scrambling to figure out why everything was unraveling so quickly. The irony, of course, was that I had warned him for years. I had told him clients needed personal attention. I had reminded him that trust couldn't be delegated to a generic service team. He hadn't listened then, and now he was paying the price. The first strike had landed, and the damage was visible. But I wasn't done, not even close. Because revenge isn't just about payback. It's about making the person who wronged you live in the wreckage of their own arrogance. As I closed another deal and secured yet another client, I realized this was no longer about simply proving my worth. It was about taking control of the very thing he believed he owned. One by one, contract by contract, I was dismantling his empire and building my own in its place. The first strike had been a success. The question now was simple. How much could he lose before he finally realized who had really been running his company all along? The game had only just begun. Revenge is rarely a single blow. It's not the thunderclap of one storm, but the steady, unrelenting downpour that soaks everything through. By the time my first client signed with me, I had already sensed the rhythm of collapse. The company I once devoted myself to wasn't built on strength. It was built on appearances. And appearances, once cracked, spread like fault lines through glass. The manufacturing firm leaving wasn't just a lost contract. It was a headline. In business, people notice when a major account shifts, and they start asking questions. Why did they leave? What went wrong? Who failed them? My boss was desperate to keep it quiet, but you can't hide a hole that size in a sinking ship. I hadn't reached out to my second target yet when another client contacted me directly. Word had spread that I was no longer with the company, and they wanted to know why. They had already grown frustrated with late responses and sloppy work since I left, and now, realizing I was available elsewhere, they asked a simple question. Can we work with you instead? That was the domino effect in motion. One falls, and the rest follow. What made this all the sweeter was how little effort it took. I didn't need to beg or plead. My boss had done all the heavy lifting for me. By firing me so abruptly, by dismissing me as replaceable, he had exposed the very weakness I now exploited. The clients hadn't been loyal to his company. They had been loyal to me. And now that loyalty had a new home. Soon, the calls and emails came more frequently. Clients who had seemed stable under the company's banner began wavering. Some were polite, cautious, dipping their toes in the water. Others were blunt, openly frustrated at the sudden lack of care. And with each conversation, my new consultancy grew stronger. The dominoes weren't just falling, they were crashing down in waves. Inside the company, the tension mounted. Former coworkers fed me stories that sounded almost unreal. Emergency meetings that stretched late into the night. Managers snapping at each other, scrambling to cover deadlines they were weeks behind on. And at the center of it all, my replacement, the supposed savior who was meant to prove I wasn't necessary. But he wasn't saving anything. He was drowning. I could almost picture it. The disorganized desk, the frantic typing, the stammered excuses during client calls. It wasn't his fault, not entirely. He had been thrown into a position he couldn't possibly fill. But to me, that didn't matter. Because the damage he caused was the rope tightening around my boss's neck. And my boss. Oh, how I savored imagining his expression. The arrogance, once carved so deeply into his smirk, now curdling into frustration and panic. For years, he had believed clients were just numbers in a system, interchangeable and easy to control. Now he was learning the truth. People don't stay loyal to faceless corporations. They stay loyal to trust. And trust cannot be replaced. But revenge wasn't just about watching him fail. It was about building something greater in his shadow. Each time I gained a new client, I didn't just take them from the company. I gave them better service, faster responses, and a level of attention they had never experienced under my boss's watch. My consultancy wasn't large, but it was nimble, personal, and efficient. Clients didn't feel like contracts, they felt like partners. And they rewarded that with loyalty deeper than I had ever seen before. Soon, I realized something important. My revenge was no longer just about payback. It was about transformation. What had begun as a plan to prove my worth had evolved into something larger, the creation of an empire, one client at a time, built on the ashes of the company that discarded me. And as I built, the dominoes kept falling. One client, then 3, then 7. Some left quietly, slipping away without making a scene. Others left loudly, tearing into the company for its failures before walking out the door. Each departure carved deeper wounds into the company's reputation. Each loss magnified my boss's desperation. The whispers inside the office became shouts. Employees questioned management openly. Resignations piled up. And soon, the staff I had once worked beside were reaching out to me, not just for updates, but for opportunities. They saw where the tide was turning, and they wanted to be on the winning side. And that's when it hit me. The domino effect wasn't limited to clients. It was spreading through employees too. My boss wasn't just losing contracts. He was losing his people. One by one, those who had once sat under his thumb began drifting my way. At first, it was quiet inquiries. Do you need extra help? Then, it became outright offers. If you're hiring, I'll walk today. And with each new addition, my consultancy grew not just in clients, but in strength. By the third month, the picture was undeniable. The company was collapsing. Not in one dramatic explosion, but in a steady, relentless unraveling. And through it all, I never once raised my voice or shouted my victory. I simply worked, steadily and calmly, taking what was rightfully mine while my boss watched everything slip through his fingers. That's the true power of the domino effect. It doesn't stop once it starts. It spreads, unstoppable, until the entire structure comes crashing down. But I wasn't satisfied yet. Because while the company was crumbling, my boss still sat at the top. He still had his title, his office, his illusion of control. And as long as he did, the revenge wasn't complete. The dominoes had fallen. The company was weak. The time was coming for the final, decisive blow. The kind of strike that would not just wound him, but destroy the very empire he thought was untouchable. The unraveling of a company doesn't happen all at once. It's not like a tower collapsing in a single crash. It's more like the steady groan of wood under pressure, cracks spreading quietly until, finally, the structure gives way. By the time the third month had passed, the cracks in my old company had become chasms. What had once looked strong now looked fragile, and what had once seemed untouchable was clearly on its last legs. But while the company staggered, my boss still clung to his throne. That was what bothered me most. Despite the mounting losses, despite the clients leaving in droves, despite the staff walking out the door, he still sat in his corner office, pretending everything was fine. Arrogance had carried him this far, and arrogance was keeping him blind. That blindness was my opportunity. By then, I had taken more than half of the company's major clients. Not through theft, not through underhanded tricks, but simply by being there when they needed me most. They didn't want the company, they wanted me. And yet, my boss still hadn't admitted defeat. He doubled down instead. He sent out desperate marketing campaigns, hired flashy consultants, even slashed prices in a last-ditch attempt to keep contracts alive. It didn't work. You can't slap paint on a crumbling wall and expect it to stand. Inside the company, morale was gone. Employees were no longer whispering about leaving. They were walking out the door in waves. The halls that once buzzed with activity now sat half-empty. Projects stalled, deadlines passed unmet, and the once proud office now looked like a ghost town. And yet, my boss refused to acknowledge the truth. He blamed everyone else, his managers, his staff, even the clients themselves, for the failures. But never himself. Never the decision that had started it all, firing me. That denial fueled me. Because revenge isn't just about taking away what someone has. It's about making them see the truth they tried to ignore. And I wasn't going to stop until my boss was forced to confront it head-on. The breaking point came with a single phone call. It was from one of the last remaining big clients still tied to the company, a financial firm with a long-standing contract. They had weathered the storm longer than most, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of fear of change. But now, they were at their limit. The service had become unbearable, and they wanted to know if I could step in. I didn't hesitate. When they signed with me, it wasn't just another contract. It was the last domino, the one that toppled everything else. That account had been the company's safety net, the one thing my boss believed he could count on. Losing them meant not just financial disaster, but total collapse. The fallout was immediate. My contacts still inside the company told me about the scene that followed. The shouting, the slammed doors, the frantic phone calls. My boss had finally realized he wasn't just losing clients. He was losing the empire he had built his identity around. And I was the one dismantling it, piece by piece. But revenge, at its purest, isn't only about destruction. It's about timing. You don't stop when your enemy is wounded. You stop when they're on their knees. And my boss wasn't there yet. He was flailing, but he still held the illusion of power. I wanted to shatter that illusion completely. So I waited. I knew the company's finances couldn't hold much longer. The loss of clients meant a loss of revenue. The loss of employees meant projects went unfinished. The failed marketing campaigns drained resources. The sinking ship was taking on water faster than anyone could bail it out. And then it happened. The company missed payroll. The news spread like wildfire. Employees who had hung on out of loyalty or desperation now realized they had no future there. Within days, entire departments walked out. The office was practically abandoned. And with no staff to hold it together, the company's last projects ground to a halt. From the outside, clients saw only chaos. From the inside, it was worse: panic, betrayal, and collapse. And at the center of it all, my boss, once untouchable, now stood isolated, surrounded by the wreckage of his own arrogance. I should have felt satisfied then. After all, my plan had worked. The company was broken, its reputation destroyed, its contracts gone. But I didn't. Not yet. Because the final piece of revenge wasn't about the company. It was about him. He had called me replaceable. He had looked me in the eye and told me everything I had built meant nothing. And now I wanted him to see the truth, that it wasn't the company that had power. It was me. It had always been me. The breaking point had come for the company. Now it was time for the breaking point to come for him. And I knew exactly how to deliver it. Revenge is not complete until the one who wronged you is forced to face the truth they tried so hard to ignore. I had dismantled the company, brick by brick, but the man who fired me still sat in his glass tower, clutching to pride like a drowning man clings to driftwood. The time had come to deliver the strike that would finally break him. I had thought long and hard about how this would end. Would I confront him directly? Would I watch him from afar, knowing I had won? Or would I engineer a moment so undeniable that he would be forced once and for all to see me as the very thing he claimed I wasn't? Irreplaceable. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A long-standing industry conference was approaching, the kind where companies sent their top executives to boast, network, and prove their strength. For years, my boss had strutted through that event like a king, using it as a stage to flaunt the contracts and clients that his leadership had secured. It was his domain, his arena, his performance. And this year, I decided to attend. Not as an employee, not as a forgotten face in the background, but as the head of my own firm. By now, my consultancy was no longer just a small operation. It had grown quickly, fueled by the contracts I had taken and the employees who had defected to join me. We weren't just surviving, we were thriving. My firm had gained a reputation for speed, reliability, and trust, and the name was spreading far faster than I had imagined. So I walked into that conference with a badge bearing my company's logo, a roster of clients that once belonged to my old boss, and a quiet confidence that I had never felt before. It didn't take long for word to spread. Attendees glanced at me, whispered to each other, some with surprise, others with recognition. And then the real power play unfolded. One by one, clients approached me, not him. They shook my hand, congratulated me on my new venture, and spoke openly about how glad they were to be working with me. They didn't even glance in his direction. I didn't need to humiliate him directly. The silence that surrounded him did the work for me. He stood there, once the center of attention, now ignored like a relic of the past. The very people he had once boasted about keeping loyal were now standing proudly by my side. I caught sight of him across the room more than once. His jaw clenched, his forced smile cracking, his eyes narrowing as he realized the truth he had been denying. He hadn't lost clients to chance. He hadn't lost employees to misfortune. He had lost everything because of one decision: firing me. That was the final blow, not a confrontation, not a shouting match, but a stage he had once owned, stripped from him in front of everyone. The conference was a showcase of power, and all the power was mine. By the end of the event, the whispers had become open conversations. People talked about how quickly my firm had risen, how impressive the client list was, how the old company had fallen behind. And my boss, once the man who commanded the room, left quietly, shoulders slumped, his reputation shattered in the very place he once flaunted it. That night, I reflected on the journey. The company was crumbling into irrelevance, its contracts gone, its staff gutted, its reputation in tatters. And my boss, the man who thought I was replaceable, now faced the reality that I had not only replaced his company, but had outgrown it. But revenge has a curious way of changing shape. What began as a desire to hurt him had transformed into something larger. I no longer needed to see him suffer to feel vindicated. I had built something greater, stronger, and more resilient than he ever had. The revenge wasn't just in his failure, it was in my success. Still, I can't deny the satisfaction. Watching him stand alone at that conference, powerless and forgotten, was the closure I had been waiting for. It was the moment that tied everything together. He had called me replaceable, and now he was the one replaced by me, by my company, by the truth he could no longer escape. The final blow had landed, and with it, the revenge was complete. But the story didn't end there, because revenge, when carried out properly, doesn't just destroy the past. It shapes the future. And my future was only beginning. Revenge is often imagined as a fiery explosion, a single dramatic act that leaves nothing but ashes. But in reality, the sweetest revenge is quieter, deeper, and longer lasting. It lingers. It reshapes not just the person you target, but the person you become in the process. By the time the dust settled, my old company was no longer a competitor. It was a cautionary tale. Clients had abandoned it, employees had walked away, and its reputation in the industry had collapsed beyond repair. What had once been a proud, bustling office was now little more than a husk, an empty shell of arrogance and wasted potential. And my boss, he disappeared from the spotlight. The man who once strutted through conferences, who once boasted of his leadership and power, now avoided those gatherings entirely. His name, once attached to success, had become a warning. People whispered about him not with admiration, but with pity. The empire he had built on appearances and ego was gone, undone not by chance, not by the market, not by misfortune, but by the very person he had dismissed as replaceable. And that was the sweetest part of all. But here's the truth I came to realize. The real revenge wasn't in his downfall. It was in my rise. At first, I had been driven by anger, by the sting of betrayal, by the desire to see him fail. But as my firm grew, as clients came on board, as employees found new purpose under my leadership, the anger began to fade. What replaced it was something far more satisfying: pride. Pride that I had built something better. Pride that I had proven my worth not just to him, but to myself. Every late-night call I answered, every problem I solved, every client who told me, "We're glad we're with you now," those moments became my new fuel. They reminded me that success doesn't come from titles or offices or glass towers. It comes from trust, from persistence, from proving again and again that you are not replaceable. In the end, my boss never apologized. He never admitted his mistake. People like him rarely do, but he didn't have to, because his silence, his absence, and his downfall said everything words never could. The sweetest revenge wasn't watching him fail. It was knowing that his failure no longer mattered to me. What mattered was the future I had carved out of the rubble he left behind. A future where clients weren't treated like contracts, but like people. A future where employees weren't treated as replaceable, but as valued partners. A future where I no longer sought approval from someone else's empire, but built an empire of my own. That was the ultimate victory. Not just revenge, but freedom. Looking back now, I realize that being fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to see my own value, to take control of my own path, and to prove, without a shadow of doubt, that I was never replaceable. And as for my boss, he gave me the push I didn't know I needed. He tore me away from a place that never truly valued me, and in doing so, he gave me the chance to create something far greater than he ever could. So, yes, I took his clients. I took his staff. I took his reputation. But more importantly, I took back my life. And that, in the end, is the sweetest revenge of all.